Taylor Heinicke remains the Falcons starter in Week 10. What does this mean for their floor and ceiling as an offense?
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another illustrious episode of the Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, part of Locked On Sports Atlanta, your team every day. And today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. And guys, if you don't know me, I'm your very humble host, Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com, RIP. Was going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, RIP. RIP to Arthur Smith's mustache. But we appreciate each and every one of you guys that makes this illustrious podcast your first listen. All you have to do to become an everydayer of this podcast is subscribe or follow for free on YouTube or wherever you listen to podcasts. So today we're going to be sort of talking a little bit about this. We're not going to spend that much time talking about this Vikings game because, you know, we'll talk about the Vikings game tomorrow when we get to the All-22 review, but we'll talk about sort of the big picture stuff. And we'll start that conversation talking about, you know, the confirmation that Taylor Heinicke would start this week against the Arizona Cardinals. And Arthur Smith didn't want to sort of say that it was a permanent move or anything like that. He said basically Taylor will be the starter this week and we'll reassess during and after the bye. So probably moving forward, Taylor Heinicke will probably be the starter for the remainder of the season. But again, this is not going to be a conversation that immediately goes away. Now, I'll be curious when I go and watch the All-22 tomorrow and watch Heinicke. You know, watching the game live on Sunday, you know, I was a little underwhelmed with Heinicke's performance. Rewatching the broadcast copy earlier today, it didn't really change my opinion of underwhelmness. And we'll see if, you know, I feel better or worse about it after watching the film. But it's interesting because, you know, the last couple of days leading into this Vikings game, I heard a lot of folks talking about how Heinicke had the potential to maybe raise the floor of this offense, that one of the things that he could be better at than Desmond Ridder was getting the ball out quicker. I didn't really agree with that assessment based off of what Heinicke did against the Titans, as well as his overall body of work from what I've seen of him over the last couple of years in Washington. And for me, when I think about whether or not Heinicke's going to raise the floor of this offense, I kind of think he's going to lower the floor of this offense. And we have a relatively small sample size, you know, only 6 quarters of play from Taylor Heinicke, but I don't think he's really raising the floor in those 6 quarters, right? I think he's kind of lowering it. But I think the thing that you will say about Taylor Heinicke is I think he's potentially raising the ceiling of this offense, and then most of that is due to the explosiveness that we've seen over the last 6 quarters that we were not seeing consistently prior to that. And again, it's a small sample size, but through 6 quarters of play, Taylor Heinicke, the Falcons have generated 8 20-plus yard plays, 8 explosive plays, 7 passes, 1 run. And if basically he can maintain that pace, which probably he won't, but if he does maintain that pace, basically on a per game, per quarter basis, whatever you want to say, this offense is 75% more explosive with Taylor Heinicke at the helm through 6 quarters than it was over the previous 30 quarters that they were with Desmond Ridder at the helm. And one of the things that you've heard me say on this podcast that like I don't have agendas, and I believe that. You know, I know some people don't agree with me. You know, my only agenda on this podcast is truth. But if there is an agenda that I do push consistently on this podcast, it is that explosiveness matters, right? That basically my philosophy boils down to explosiveness equals points, because I've been collecting data about the Falcons' ability to generate explosive plays since 2010. You know, not necessarily league-wide, but at least in Atlanta. And basically the numbers bear out that, you know, on average, you're going to average about 3 more points per drive that includes a 20-plus yard play than a drive that does not have one. You're going to be 3 times as likely to reach the red zone on one of those explosive drives versus when you don't have one. And you're going to score at a rate 3 times higher on those explosive drives, right? So that's where the explosiveness equals points sort of narrative comes from. And, I think that raises the ceiling for your offense, obviously, because the goal offensively is to score as many points as you can. And, you're going to probably win more games if you score a lot of points, if you can be explosive, than, trying to win every game 17-14, right? Now, one of the things when it comes to the floor conversation with Taylor Heinicke is what's notable to me is on these explosive drives, the Falcons have not been reaching the red zone as consistently as they should, right? That we've had basically 6 drives where the Falcons had an opportunity, 6 explosive drives in these last 6 quarters with Heinicke, where the Falcons have had an opportunity to reach the red zone. So we're excluding the drive where Jonnu Smith on Sunday got the 60-yard touchdown. That drive also had a 20-yard play from Kadero Hodge earlier in that drive. So excluding that, right? And again, it's still a small sample size, but we're comparing these 6 drives versus the 25 drives that we saw from Desmond Ridder when the Falcons had opportunities to reach the red zone. And only about 33% of Heinicke's drives, of these explosive drives, have reached the red zone when it was 60% for Desmond Ridder. Now, I think as that sample increases, right, that should equalize, right? I don't think that number is going to stay that low. But the data that I have going back to 2010, basically on average, whether it was Matt Ryan or Marcus Mariota or whatever, that number in terms of explosive drives reaching the red zone, about 60% of those, 57 to be exact, percent of those drives reach the red zone. So that number should normalize. But I think part of the reason why that number has been low, at least for these 6 quarters, is because of Heinicke's inefficiencies as a passer. Going back to what I said earlier, where when people were saying like, oh, he'll, essentially be more efficient than Ridder and raise the floor of this offense. I don't think that's true. And again, that to me has been expressed again in this limited sample that we've had of a game and a half of Taylor Heinicke being a starter. And again, a lot of it is just due to Heinicke's play style, right? He's, his role model growing up was Brett Favre. And one of the things that he's talked about himself and that changed his career is he started to play more free, play more loose, trying to basically channel Brett Favre. Now he's very much a very, very poor man's Brett Favre, right? So I don't think we should be surprised that this is it's kind of a roller coaster, right? But, there's a couple of examples I've seen on film last week, and we'll see what the film says this week, but watching the game live, where after the Falcons were able to generate explosive plays, you didn't see this offense be able to sustain. Last week against Tennessee, you saw that 21-yard play to Drake London where he hit London. London wound up getting hurt on that play and exiting the game. But then you look at Heinicke's next 2 passes on that same drive. He was kind of big play hunting, right? He to me, he came out of the huddle on his next pass, taking a deep shot to Mac Hollins, even though he had a wide open Jonnu Smith underneath on that play. Then the next pass on the 3rd down, there was a design swing pass to Bijan. But at the beginning of that play, he kind of peeked to the backside where he had Kadero Hodge one-on-one, hoping that Kadero Hodge could potentially win his one-on-one matchup, even though the design of the play was to go in another direction. And this week against Minnesota, you had that 31-yard play to Kadero Hodge to start the second series this past Sunday. And then his next pass came on the subsequent 3rd and 7, and he missed an open Kyle Pitts and nearly was picked on that play. And so we'll see, if this is backed up when I watch the film. But, one of the things that I talked to the Locked On Falcons insiders when I did the extended all 22 review last week was those 2 passes in particular in that Titans game, the Hollins and that missed swing pass to Bijan, where Heinicke was kind of big play hunting. And those are the types of insights that you guys can get, becoming a Locked On Falcons insider, right? You'll also get my insights, my thoughts, first and foremost on any sort of breaking news. You get that one-on-one communication. And of course you get access to the extended all 22 reviews. If you want to become a Locked On Falcons insider, just hit the link in the description below. But, I think in a lot of ways, this sort of roller coaster, we could say, with Taylor Heinicke is kind of reminiscent to me of the Mariota coaster, right? And part of the reason why I don't want to take credit, but I know the reason why I started using the term Mariota coaster. I don't want to say I was the first person on the planet to coin that phrase, but the part of the reason why I thought Mariota would be this roller coaster because you would get similar highs and lows. You would get these big plays and you would get these lows because of the inefficiency. And with Mariota, those big plays I thought were going to be related to his legs, right? His ability to create off structure and just sort of heave up bombs down the field, which is something that he did at a semi-regular basis in Tennessee, right? And the hope was that the highs would outweigh the lows with Mariota. And we didn't really get that, right? Because we didn't get that many. We got a sprinkling of those off structure plays, but we didn't get too many of that, right? And, we'll see what happens with Heinicke, but, the hope is that those highs will get that sort of balance that we were looking for last year with Mariota, where we get those highs, those explosive pass plays down the field. He'll take his shots. Again, he thinks he's Brett Favre, right? No one else does, but he thinks he is. And as long as he thinks it, it's fine, right? So hopefully we'll get those highs outweighing the lows, but there's still going to be lows. And the way that the Falcons can mitigate some of those lows is by, if the floor based purely off of Taylor Heinicke's passing is going to be low because of those inefficiencies, the way that the Falcons can raise that floor with their offense is through the run game, right? And that was something that the Falcons were able to do effectively, running the football, that is, with Mariota last year. And that's part of the reason why, despite not getting as many highs, the Falcons were able to have some success with Mariota at the beginning of last year. And we know that the Falcons are not running the ball effectively this year. And we'll talk more about how this plays into, what this offense can be under Taylor Heinicke moving forward, and why this offense, this run game is so critical. And later we'll talk about why this is, part of the conversation that involves, Arthur Smith and potentially his job security. So we'll get into all of that, guys, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. But first, guys, I want to tell you about PrizePicks, the most exciting way to play daily fantasy sports. And now that basketball season is here, they got a new feature where you can combine projections across multiple sports in their specials league, especially football and basketball. It's a league created to create combo projections for two or more players from different sports. So, for example, you can combine LeBron James and Travis Kelce on 3 points made and receptions. And if you have the skills, you can turn $10 into $250. That's just one of many ways you can do so. That's the great thing about PrizePicks. It's simple. All you got to do is pick two or more players, pick more or less on their projected stats. The more entries you make, the more money you can make, up to 25 times your money. You got quick withdrawals, easy gameplay, an enormous selection of players and stat types that are going to make PrizePicks the #1 daily fantasy sports app. Just go to prizepicks.com/lockedonnfl. Use code LOCKEDONNFL in lowercase for a first deposit match up to $100. That's prizepicks.com/lockedonnfl. Use promo code LOCKEDONNFL. PrizePicks is daily fantasy made easy. So as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, I do also want to plug the Locked On NFL Kickoff Live each and every Friday across the entire Locked On NFL YouTube network. You can get that preview with my good buddy Jarvis Davis, as well as so many folks from across the entire Locked On NFL network that are going to preview each weekend's slate of games. Of course, that's free and available Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern. If you're already subscribed to Locked On Falcons, you will get that here on Locked On Falcons, or, if you're on Locked On Cowboys or Locked On Packers, you'll get it there as well. But, if you haven't subscribed to Locked On Falcons, please do, so that you can check out Locked On NFL Kickoff Live every Friday at 2 p.m. Eastern on the Locked On NFL YouTube channel. So we're talking about the Falcons getting big plays at a higher rate under Taylor Heinicke, but they aren't finishing those drives in the red zone, basically giving themselves scoring opportunities to the degree that they have before. And by the way, if you're curious how Ritter, Heinicke, and Mariota compare, again, Falcons were getting to the red zone about 61% of the time on Mariota's big play drives last year. So again, as I said, I expect that number, that 33% number with Heinicke currently through 6 quarters, that number should go up over the next couple of weeks. But I think part of the reason why this offense isn't being able to sustain on these after they get a big play, for example, let's say they get a 30-yard play, and then you look at Heinicke's passing after that, he's been struggling in that regard, right? And, he's only completing about 33% of his passes on these drives after the Falcons get a big play. And you compare that to Desmond Ridder, who was completing about 60% of his passes, right? And this is contributing why Taylor Heinicke overall is only completing less than 60% of his passes. So he's not necessarily an efficient passer at this point in time, right? But, if you go beyond passer rating or completion percentage, and you look at other sort of efficiency metrics like success rate, passer rating, adjusted net yards per attempt, or Anya, Ridder is still better than Heinicke in those numbers, especially on these big play drives after generating a big play and hoping to sustain offense. But his efficiency numbers aren't great, right? But he's still better than Heinicke, right? It's like 79 passer rating for Heinicke versus an 89 for Desmond Ridder, or maybe it's a 70 versus an 80, but something like that. Again, it's not a great passer rating for Ridder, but he's still better. So it wasn't as if the Falcons were particularly efficient under Ridder either in these situations passing the football. But the Falcons were still finding ways to get to the red zone. And again, I think some of that is owed to their ability to run the football. That because you're not getting high-level quarterback play, throwing the ball, especially on these drives where you're flipping field position and you want to sustain that to get into the red zone and score points, touchdowns hopefully, right? But part of the success for the Falcons is being able to run the ball, right? And I can use an example. You go back to that Tampa Bay game, right? In the fourth quarter of that game, we saw Desmond Ridder break outside the pocket, lob up a throw to Tyler Algier, and he rumbled down the field for a 46-yard gain, right? Now, that happened to be the drive where Desmond Ridder fumbled at the end. But what was notable about that drive up until that point was right after that big play, the Falcons handed the ball off 6 consecutive plays. They gained 37 yards. So they were able to sustain their offense by running the football after generating that explosive play. That's kind of what the Falcons' bread and butter is, right? And that Tampa Bay game was one of the few instances this season where we've seen this Falcons run game be effective and efficient, right? And you go back to the final drive, and I talked about this on yesterday's Rapid Reaction, but you go back to the final scoring drive, I should say, not the final drive, penultimate drive, but second to last drive. For those of you that, don't know what penultimate means. But, you saw the Falcons, run the ball 11 out of the 13 plays in that drive, not counting Taylor Heinicke scramble, right? And their success rate on those 11 plays was 55%. That was a really efficient number, very good number for the Falcons. But prior to that drive, if you take that drive out of the equation and you look at the Falcons' run efficiency in that Vikings game, it was 23%, which is terrible, right? But that last drive, that penultimate drive, looked a lot like the Falcons' offense from last year. That team that was like, we're going to pound the ball down your throat and you can't stop us. And that's what they look like. And we need to see more of that this season, especially if this offense is going to sustain itself. Because again, we're talking about it in the context of explosive plays, but again, Taylor Heinicke's not an efficient passer. He's never been an efficient passer. That's not, you go back to Washington's success. When I remember watching Washington beat Philadelphia last year, how they beat them? Brian Robinson, not Taylor Heinicke. Right? Brian Robinson basically put the team on his back and carried Washington to victory against the Eagles last year. Right? And so that to me is really what this offense is built to be. Now, their run game isn't terrible, but it just simply hasn't been reliable. And for 3.5 quarters on Sunday against the Vikings, it was unreliable. Right? And that has been a through line throughout the season. So I could throw more numbers at you to basically illustrate the point that how big a drop off this running game has been. Basically the numbers, you just look at last year's first 9 games and this year's first 9 games, right? You don't see the dominance that you saw, right? You saw dominant performances from this Falcons run game, but you also saw their floor as a running game was still a very efficient offense, right? For example, you look at the success rate. I'll throw a couple of numbers at you, right? Success rate of 45% is a healthy rushing game. And for those of you that don't know about success rate basically measures rushing efficiency, or really offensive efficiency, but in this context, rushing efficiency based off of down and distance, right? It doesn't treat like yards per carry does, which is the normal efficiency metric that a lot of people use. Yards per carry, the flaw in yards per carry is it treats every yard the same, right? It says all yards are equal, right? So for example, yards per carry will tell you an 11-yard gain on a 3rd and 17 is better than a 2-yard gain on a 3rd and 1. Success rate wouldn't tell you that. Success rate would tell you that 2-yard gain is good, right? So based off of that, a 45% success rate is a good number. That is a healthy, very good running game. Ideally you can get that number to 50% or higher. But last year in the first 9 games, every game the Falcons, and we're not counting quarterback runs or scrambles or anything, just handoffs to the running back. The Falcons, when they handed the ball off to a running back in the first 9 games last year, they had a success rate for a 45% or higher in every game last year. This year, they've only had a 45% success rate or higher in 3 games this year. Now, granted, in week 1 against Carolina, they had a 44% success rate. So, but what was notable about last year's offense is you had 4 games last year where you had a success rate of over 50%, which is a very good number for success rate. This year, you have 3 games. But those 4 games last year where you had a success rate over 50%, they were actually over 67%. And 67% success rate is dominance, right? The trick with success rate, one trick that you can use when I throw these numbers, because when I say 42 versus 44 versus 48 versus 52, those don't seem drastically different. But one trick that you can use with success rate, especially when it comes to the run game, is double the number and think of it like a quarterback rating. So a 42% success rate would be like an 84 passer rating, which would be roughly league average. Meh, A 35% success rate, if you doubled it, would be a 70 passer rating. And that would make you a bad quarterback, right? Someone would be like, bench that guy. 50% would be 100 passer rating, which would mean you're one of the better quarterbacks in the league. If you get above 55%, Aaron Rodgers had an MVP season a couple of years ago where his passer rating was 120, which, the equivalent in success rate, if you have that, is 60%. So that's what we're talking about. 67%, 4 games of 67% is like MVP level running game. That's kind of how you think about it. We're not getting anywhere close. The highest success rate the Falcons have had this year was that Packer game where they had a 57% success rate. So, by the way, as I said, final drive, they had their penultimate drive, their success rate was 55%. So very good on that drive, but 23%. So again, you're talking about a 46 quarterback passer versus 110, right? We're talking about, peak Tom Brady, peak Aaron Rodgers, peak Matt Ryan versus, Zach Wilson, Deshaun Kaiser. I don't know. Think of a historically bad. That's kind of the difference in terms of the Falcons rushing success. So that conversation about the Falcons' inability to running ball, I think directly informs the conversation that we're beginning to have about, is Arthur Smith on the hot seat? And to me, everybody makes it about the quarterback and his decision to pick Desmond Ridder or his inability to develop a quarterback as a reason why people are now discussing, is Arthur Smith on the hot seat? But it's really, to me, about the run game and other issues with the team. And we'll talk about that to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. Guys, make sure you score early this season with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers get a $150 in bonus bets with a winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. And, that doesn't mean you got to bet on the Falcons, guys. Your team could be the Chiefs when it comes to FanDuel, right? And so this is a great opportunity. If you've been thinking about joining FanDuel, there's no better time to get on the action. And it's not just money line, which is straight up bets for those of you that don't know, but you can also bet spreads, player props, over-unders, so much more. All you got to do to play is visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. And you can kick off this NFL season by putting that extra $150 in your pocket. FanDuel is an official partner of the NFL. So let's wrap up talking a little bit about Arthur Smith being on the hot seat. And the fact that we're having this conversation at this point in the season is a conversation I didn't think we were going to have this year. Right. And this, we're asking questions. Is Arthur Smith on the hot seat? Should Arthur Smith be in the hot seat? Now, I'll say this, and again, this opinion may change in a couple of weeks, a couple of months. I don't expect Arthur Smith to get fired at this point. I'm a fool. Right. I still think this team is going to find a way, or I hope this team is going to find a way to finish this season with a winning record. And, you don't typically fire coaches that have a winning record, especially given where this team is in their rebuild. But right now, they're 4-5. My expectation is that, they'll find a way to win against Arizona, even though it's not going to be pretty, because it never is. And then they'll come out of the bye, they'll fix what they got to fix, and they'll find a way to win at least 4 out of the last 7. Right. And if you go back to my preseason prediction at this point, or going into their bye, I had predicted them to be 6-4. So if they can get to 5-5, they're not, season's not over. They're not too far behind the 8 ball. And then I thought they would win 4 out of the last 7. Now, given how they've played the last couple of weeks, especially, This is not a team that looks like, right, the last in recency bias, if you want to call it that, does not look like a team that's poised to do that. So again, this is why I say I'm a fool, because I'm foolishly thinking that they're going to figure it out, that this team is capable. And a big part of that is my belief that Arthur Smith is a better coach than what this team has shown in recent weeks. But if they don't figure it out, the conversation about Arthur Smith and his job security is only going to get louder. And I know to some people, this is going to sound like I'm just passing the buck because, I'm not going to sit here and blame Desmond Ridder, as so many people have. As I've said many times on this podcast in recent days and weeks, I think the conversation has been about the quarterback because it's the nature of the position, but I don't think this season's really boiled down to the quarterback. Yes, Desmond Ridder has been a disappointment, but I think there's been people pushing this narrative that he's been this disaster and he's the cause of the downfall of the season. And, it goes back to a conversation we had a couple of months ago about expectations. That if you had asked me 2-3 months ago, what would, on a 10-point scale, where would I expect Desmond Ridder to be at this point in the season? I'd probably think he'd be like a 5 out of 10, roughly average starting quarterback, with the idea that in the back half of the season, he could improve to a 6 or higher. And that would be the thing that would click for the Falcons and get them, into the postseason. And I would say through 8 games that we saw of Desmond Ridder, 7.5 games that we saw of Desmond Ridder, I'd say he was probably a 4 out of 10. Now, it wasn't a smooth 4, right? Some weeks it looked like a 2, some weeks it looked like a 6, but overall it was probably a 4 out of 10. So to me, my expectations of him being a 5 and him actually being a 4, to me, isn't crazy. Now, no doubt Desmond Ridder was a disappointment because of that. But there's going to be this narrative among some folks that like Arthur Smith deserves to be fired because he made a terrible bet on Desmond Ridder. And I don't agree with that, right? A 5 turning into a 4 is not betting on a 5 that actually turns out to be a 4 is not a terrible bet. That's not why we're having this conversation about Arthur Smith's job security. We're having this conversation about Arthur Smith's job security because the Falcons don't look like a well-coached football team. And they haven't especially looked unlike a well-coached football team these past 2 games against Tennessee and Minnesota. And, the whole selling point of the season was, not, hey, Desmond Ridder's going to be a star, guys. It was like, we got to find out about Desmond Ridder. The selling point of the season was all the stuff around Desmond Ridder was going to set him up for success because we thought this team was going to be a well-coached football team that has a question mark at the quarterback position. And, I'll reiterate what I kind of said on yesterday's episode, which is the bet was that everything around the quarterback was going to be good, but those have been the things that have been much bigger disappointments of the quarterback itself, right? The run game, the offensive line, the skill position players, the defense, right? The defense is the only thing that's come close to living up to the expectations and exceeding those expectations through the first part of the season. But the last 2 games, it feels like the defense is coming back down to earth. And so I can imagine a scenario in a couple of years where someone's going to, be tweeting or whatever, and I'm like, oh, I just got pissed off all over again because Arthur Smith made this terrible bet on Desmond Ridder instead of Lamar Jackson or insert whoever. And again, I'm going to be the person, if I'm back on Twitter, who knows, right? I'm going to be a person like, that wasn't the bad bet, guys. Rolling with Ridder into the season was not this terrible plan that some people will lead you to believe it is, right? What has been the bigger disappointment is we figured that, it wasn't a terrible plan because we figured, okay, we don't know what Ridder is, but we feel good about this supporting cast, right? And the rest of the roster is going to be solid. And we think Arthur Smith's a good coach, and this is going to be a well-coached football team. We're going to be competitive every week, and they have been competitive every week. But this last month especially, this team consistently has found ways, despite being competitive, that when they get opportunities to shoot themselves in the foot. And that's why they're not a well-coached football team. The penalties, the negative plays, the turnovers, the big plays that they're giving up. Having Josh Dobbs dead to rights multiple times, and then he breaks, 3 tackles, scores a touchdown, does, backflips, all this stuff that he seemed like he was doing on Sunday against this defense, right? And those are going to be the things that Arthur Smith and company are going to have to clean up if they're going to salvage this thing and end this conversation about his job security. So quarterback's still going to remain a question mark. Hopefully we'll feel better about that 2 months from now than we do today, but we'll see. But it's really about the other 10 guys on offense and the 11 guys on defense that to me are going to really determine, if this conversation about Arthur Smith and him being on the hot seat maintains a conversation or it goes away. So we'll be talking tomorrow about, the all 22, and I'll be giving my thoughts on that. You guys can submit your questions. Please become a Locked On Falcons Insider. Continue to check out this show as your first listen. Check out Locked On NFL as your second listen. It's all part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.